Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining this short session on the sector deal, and in particular looking at what the sector deal might mean for us as businesses in the UK, whether you're in a developer role or indeed in the supply chain. I'm going to give a short introduction to where we are with the sector deal. Some of you will have heard some of this already from the Baroness Brown's introductory talk this morning. But then I'm going to ask my colleagues working on the sector deal to give a little bit more of an in-depth insight into what's going on in the key areas of the sector deal, which we'll come to. But I'd just like to thank Matt Smith, who's going to talk about people and skills, Emma Toulson, who's going to talk about clustering, Andy Payne, who's going to talk about our low-carbon system accelerator, and we might, I hope, be joined by Victoria Sinclair from Scottish Power, who will be talking about all the work that's going on with the supply chain. But failing that, we do have Clark McFarlane, who's leading that work as well. So any difficult questions will come to you, Clark. I'll take the easy ones. Yeah. And the idea is it's going to be an interactive session. So after we've done our we'll be as quick as we can, but then we're going to switch over to Slido. And Barnaby will be explaining how Slido works. The idea is you fire in your questions, more or less anonymously, I think. So that shouldn't encourage too difficult questions, but of course, bring out your questions, and then we will, between us, do our very best to answer your questions as we go through. So just a little bit of background on the sector deal, and for some of you this will be familiar, for others I think this might be something less familiar. What is the sector deal all about? Well, it's part of the government's industrial strategy that was initially launched with a green paper at the beginning of last year and with a white paper in November. What are they looking for? They're looking for a deal between an industrial sector and government that will transform the fortunes of that sector, and that means transforming in terms of jobs, in terms of productivity, in terms of GVA to the UK, all of the levers that the government's looking to maximise through their industrial strategy. But it absolutely needs to be transformational, and I will come back to that. At the heart of the sector deal is our vision as an offshore wind industry. I work for Ørsted, but I'm here in my capacity as the co-chair of the Offshore Wind Industry Council. And we are a collection of developers and supply chain players working with government, and we've been doing this actually for 5 years now. So this collaboration is nothing new, but very much focusing on how to build a stronger industry together. And this just gives a little snapshot of where we are today. We've actually got around 7.5 gigawatts installed. The times are moving very fast. We've got most recently Walnut Extension completed, one of the Ørsted projects. That's now the world's biggest offshore wind farm. Around 15,000 people employed directly in the industry, and many tens of thousands more indirectly around the UK, and about £500 million a year of exports. But what we want to achieve by 2030 is around 30 gigawatts installed. This should be a number that's now very familiar. It's something we've been talking about for several months. This is compared to the 20 gigawatts of installed capacity that we'll get under the business as usual scenario based on previous conversations with government. So this is quite transformative. It represents about a 4-fold increase from today's installed capacity. And it would power around a third of the UK's electricity needs. So really transformative, and putting UK offshore wind at the heart of our electricity system, the backbone of the electricity system. It would also grow jobs significantly. The number 27,000 is a very conservative, I think, view of what this industry could deliver in terms of high quality jobs around the UK, but also a 5-fold increase in exports, which in the context of the debate going on in Parliament today, with Brexit very much up the agenda and our global trading position being up for debate, it's very important that we find every opportunity to build an export capability, and I think the offshore wind industry is well placed to do that. Something that's been talked about rather less, and this is where we start as an industry, is that by the middle of this century we believe we should be achieving 50 gigawatts installed, and that's delivering half of the UK's electricity demand. That's obviously a real game changer. That does require a lot of things to happen, not just in terms of cost reduction and driving the UK supply chain, but also around system integration, storage, demand-side response, and so on. But on the back of that, of course, a further expansion of jobs and a further expansion of exports, so that we're something like 10 times the level of annual exports that we see today. There are 5 areas that we're focusing on, and I'm not going to dive into those in detail. By the way, you should have seen around the place, we have developed a prospectus which sets out in a bit more detail what we're doing in each of these areas. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. It's also on the RUK website. But we're focusing around ideas and innovation. What can we do to drive innovation, make sure the UK is anchored as the place where innovation is happening in this industry, because that really is where we will see the transformative changes that will keep the UK ahead of the competition. And as Baroness Brown said this morning, the expansion into other markets is both an opportunity and a threat to us in the UK. It's a great opportunity. The market is growing very fast, but of course other countries, other markets are looking for their own slice of the pie. So we need to take our position as first mover and build on that while we still have that time advantage. In terms of people, it's a very important agenda, not just in terms of building skills, but also diversity, and Emma will talk a little bit more about that. No, actually, Maff will talk about that, won't you? Sorry, Emma, you looked a bit worried there. Maff will talk about people. Emma will talk about place. Place is a very important agenda. Here we are in Manchester. There's a big drive in government, quite correctly, to rebalance the economy and make sure that the parts of the UK that have perhaps had the least economic prosperity since the downturn 10 years ago are starting to benefit from industries like ours, and I think we're very well placed to do that. And business environment, making sure that we create a fertile ground for that innovation that I've mentioned to turn into businesses. It's no good just innovating. We need to turn smart technology into successful businesses for UK projects, but globally as well. Oh, it's moved on. This slide really just gives you a little bit of a view of where things are happening. Again, you'll have seen this slide if you were in Baroness Brown's session. This talks to where the jobs will be and where the impact on productivity. We know the UK lags its competitors in terms of productivity. What you can see is that this is a sector that really impacts the parts of the country that other sectors don't reach. There are other much bigger sectors than us. If you look at construction, we've got over 1 million people working in construction, but construction's happening where there's already economic prosperity, of course. Same for hospitality and other large employers. I think what we bring to the table, which other sectors can't bring, is the impact in coastal communities in particular, whether that's in Scotland, the northeast and the northwest of England, around the Solent, in the east of England and so on. We are transforming those communities in terms of bringing high quality jobs, and it's a very important agenda for government that the sector deal can deliver on. Just very quickly then, what's happening? As I say, the industrial strategy was launched by government, the white paper in November of last year. We have put together a prospectus which we've put into government. As I say, there's a public version of this that you can pick up online or here in the exhibition. This sets out our ambition and what it will take to achieve that ambition. You'll have heard perhaps Baroness Brown, our sector champion. She is very much driving things in Westminster for us. She's a very strong advocate of what we want to do. She's got great connections and also very passionate about what we do. As is our supply chain champion, Martin Whitmarsh, who's here today. Thank you for dropping by, Martin. It's great to have you to come and find out what's really happening in the industry in terms of the technologies that are transforming our sector. Martin is working with a number of us in the industry to find how we can transform the UK supply chain, bring in new competitive technologies into the industry, both to build a UK industrial base, but also, of course, to continue to innovate and drive costs down. And we've got 4 work streams running, hence the 4 people we've got here today. Thank you for making it along, Victoria. Working on supply chain, Andy on the low carbon system accelerator. It sounds fancy, you can read about it and Andy will explain. Emma on clusters and Math on skills. And maybe we could start on supply chain with a quick introduction. Just before we do though, we talked quite a lot about what's going to transform things, and some of you will have heard Baroness Brown, but I think the thing that unlocks all of this rosy future, the sunny uplands that I've talked about with 30 gigawatts, tens of thousands of jobs and billions of exports, is making sure that the UK continues to have a leading position, and that means creating visibility of the pipeline. We, as many of you will know if you're working in the supply chain, knowing that there are going to be gigawatts installed every year out to 2030, that's the market that becomes investable. That's why I hope you'll want to do business here in the UK because you can see there's a pipeline of domestic projects that's more than just the next auction or the next 2 auctions, but takes us right out to that 30 gigawatt figure. That's a volume that is worth investing in, and that's what we're asking of government. So I'm now just going to hand over to Victoria. I think we're just going to hear a little bit more about each of the areas that we're investigating at the moment, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Thank you. Hands up if you can you hear me? Yeah, great, thank you. First of all, apologies for being late. There's a huge clock in the corner of the room, and yet somehow I missed the time. I'm so sorry, but I am here now, and I'm here this afternoon to talk to you about the supply chain review. I'm part of the team that's working with Martin Whitmarsh to support his review. I think one of the key things we want to tell you today about the review is that this is going to be something that feeds into the bold ambitions that we already see in the sector deal. It's going to be an integrated and linked part of the work that's going on in innovation and skills. And what we want to see is a supply chain that feeds the pipeline to 2030 that is increasing productivity in the UK, it's increasing the competition in the UK market, and it's giving you more opportunities to focus your business on an export-orientated global market. So how are we going to do that? Well, so far we have a plan to issue a prospectus to a number of businesses who are already in the market and who may be interested in getting into the market, to set out to them what the scope of the pipeline is going to be, show them that there is a huge opportunity to get involved, not just in the next 5 to 10 years, but in the next 20 years. And following that, we want to run a series of roadshow type events where the supply chain can come and speak to us about the current issues you might face, new technology you might want to invest in, how do you get to that position, and what the market looks like for you in 2030, and how do we help you unlock your potential.
Thank you, Victoria. So just to talk a little bit about what we call the Low Carbon System Accelerator. Now, the basic concept of this is to bring together stakeholders and bring together innovators to look at the challenges to deploy such large volumes of offshore wind, 30 gigawatts by 2030, as Ben said, and an aspiration for 50 by 2050. So that's going to present some challenges across the sector. So what we were doing through our Low Carbon System Accelerator is bringing stakeholders together in a variety of, in fact, 3 separate sort of sub-work streams, if you like, to look at those challenges. And the first one of those is really looking at the integration challenge, how we deal with large levels of variable generation, how we look at innovation and encourage stakeholders to bring forward these ideas, how we access some of the existing funding that's available for this sort of work and these sorts of projects, running our own innovation challenge as well. So this is effectively pulling together key stakeholders in that sector, people like National Grid and others that are already active, and other catapults, other industry sectors, systems sectors that are sort of looking at the same sorts of issues. So this is about the kind of the innovation and the engineering challenges of creating or bringing in a different type of grid really in 2030 and beyond. The second theme is really about matching and talking to high energy consumers, so large industrial consumers. Can we look at what we call power matching? Can we match their demand to the output from renewable projects? And there's a lot of thinking already going on in that sector right now. Vattenfall's got a project for example, in Sweden to power steelworks completely by wind. So we're kind of bringing together stakeholders in that space as well to work on those sorts of solutions. And then the third sort of work stream within the Low Carbon System Accelerator is about challenges to deployment. So things that we'll all be familiar with around other stakeholders and spatial constraints and things like grid and aviation and planning. Lots of work going on in those sectors right now, but bringing them all together in the context of the sector deal for a larger ambition. So Low Carbon System Accelerator is a kind of enabler to make all this happen, and it's there's a lot of work, but it's really quite exciting, and I think we can got a real opportunity here to sort of shape things for significant deployment.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, Emma, do you want to talk a bit about clusters?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay? New microphone. So it probably would be more suitable if I was at the end of the line of here, but clusters or place is very much about essentially looking at the other, I guess, areas of development, so supply chain, infrastructure, innovation and skills, and how those relate to a place. At the moment, we're pretty convinced there is some good origins and developments around places, around clusters supporting the offshore wind industry. But it's really about how do we identify the ways and means in which those clusters can grow and really bring more added value to both those areas, but also the UK as a whole, and potentially become, or if not already, export hubs as well for sort of products, services, etc., supporting the offshore wind projects globally. So far, we've had some quite interesting discussion. We've formulated a kind of focus group, a development group, which has got kind of key representatives from the sector, but it also cross references with other sector group, other workstream groups around the supply chain infrastructure to make sure that all of the different things are coming together, because it is very important that, I guess, the national offshore wind sector deal is being sort of deployed, I guess, in the place. So making sure that there's a lot of cross-referencing between. And the kind of sort of discussions that we've had so far is very much about, you tend to see quite a lot of work about clusters, identifying the different attributes of a cluster. So you'll see the skills column with all of the education and training providers in there, or you see the big investors, and you'll see the company names in there. But actually what's quite interesting is the evolution of the cluster and what actually takes it through the different stages. So our thinking is that we go from a sort of seed level to perhaps a developing level through to an advanced cluster. And really look at the engagement processes that happen between those different levels to really move it toward an advanced cluster. Other things we're looking at is obviously offshore wind's interesting, and that's our priority for the offshore wind sector deal and clusters in that sector. But actually there's some really good lessons learned by looking at other more advanced clusters and understanding the attributes that they have and how they've got to that stage. So also looking at other sectors and also looking at other locations, maybe in a European or a global context, to see how others in different locations, not in the UK, have developed and their success factors. So that's where we are at the moment. We're sort of doing that kind of analysis. Now, I guess looking towards the outcomes, so we would, I guess, envisage two outcomes, and as I say, there's a caveat here because we're still working on it, but we would like to see an outcome of this work stream being around essentially a playbook which determines this kind of conceptual model, I guess, or this evolutionary pattern with some really strong case studies in there. But I think what's also really important that we need to show is that as an industry is really getting behind these places. So seeing some real industry support, commitment, etc., to really get engaged with key clusters and key regions, areas in the UK. And that would be an ongoing process of really working with those areas to move them on.
Thanks very much, Emma. And finally, but not least, skills and people. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Benj. So, in terms of work on skills, the important to note that in putting the bid together, we commissioned an initial skills gap analysis that looked at where our people were employed, the type of roles that people were employed in. We asked questions on the gender balance within the industry, and we got input back from many of the major employers in the sector, and that showed us a lot of interesting things about our sector, which we're now seeking to investigate further. So we know, for example, we have 11,000 people in our sector directly employed. We expect that to grow to 27,000 by 2030, alongside this growth of offshore and the growth of an export market. We know about where those people are based and where the employment growth expected to be, as Ben showed you on those slides. So the next phase of that work is to conduct a more in-depth skills gap analysis, get more data from the industry about who's employed where the growth is, and particularly where the skills gaps are, that we can understand about the training needs of our sector and how we can then better coordinate as a sector, looking at relevant qualifications, skills, industry-wide programs to make sure we're meeting the needs, we're working with the right educational institutions, the right bodies, etc. And then the final aspect of that is we're thinking harder and working as an industry, so not just individual companies, but about the industry having clearer vision of its own, about how we coordinate and work with other key sectors. So we know as a growing industry, we see the evidence of it, that we're attracting people in from other sectors. Oil and gas is an obvious example. As we move further offshore, our ways of working, our patterns, our skills, we're bringing in different skill sets. As we, some of our companies looking at floating, there are many parallels between what oil and gas already does and, say, for example, anchor handling, installation, and offshore wind. So how can we make sure that we're relevant, we're recognised or able to transfer people in with the right skills quickly, and we don't ask them to essentially go back to square one, retrain for industry-specific training needs and qualifications. There's a lot we share. There are some differences. So we will be mapping those out, talking to relevant skills bodies in other sectors, and then working out with them how we can facilitate that flow of people we expect to see into our industry, out for temporary basis as we're a shared industry, but back in as our industry grows over time.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thank you all for that quick summary of what's actually quite a lot of work. We're now going to go into Q&A, and we're using Slido. So as you can see here, if you go to slido.com and use this hashtag, you can fire your questions in. I see we have one quite interesting and contentious question about, well, let's take the top one. I'd prefer to answer the second one, but I will go to the first one, and then maybe Victoria, you could take the second one. It's a very interesting question. The Dutch have this huge ambition to build an island in the North Sea and build several tens of gigawatts of offshore wind, well, off-ish shore wind, I guess you could argue whether it's on or offshore once it's on an island. I think what we need to, and I don't want to lose the idea that we would want to be part of that. I think what we need to remember is the sector deal is part of an industrial strategy which is about transforming the UK's economy, about driving productivity, driving skills, driving exports in a time frame that I think is probably not tied very well into that very ambitious but I guess slightly longer term programme. So it's absolutely not something we should lose sight of, but my personal view is it's probably something in a different time frame to what we need to build to deliver on in the sector deal. I don't know if anyone, Andy, we want to comment
I
on
would
that?
just add, I agree on the kind of the timing issue for the purpose of the sector deal, but certainly in the longer term, the kind of integration of energy networks across the North Sea is something that we are all thinking hard about as developers, and no doubt the time will come, but there's a lot of things that need to happen before that, not least of which is the regulatory structure and reform. So we certainly haven't lost sight of that, but it's probably too long term for the sector deal.
Moving on to the next question about do we need a nacelle factory as part of the sector deal? I don't know, Victoria, if you would like to comment on that.
Yes, sure. So, obviously, if somebody wants to invest in a turbine nacelle factory in the UK, that's fantastic. Huge manufacturing to bring to the UK and a lot of opportunity there. Is it a make or break for the sector deal? No, I don't think so. I think when the supply chain review puts forward recommendations to the Accelerator group, the strength is going to be on the range of potential recommendations we can make, and those should be focusing on not just the near-term manufacturing opportunities in the UK, but the long-term potential for what the UK supply chain can offer to the wider market. So we need to be thinking about things like, what are we already doing in the UK that we can do better and we can export? What are other industries doing in the UK that we could bring into our industry? And what does the industry need in the future that we know about right now that we can deliver? And that's a key area for the sector deal to show real promise, because we have the lion's share of the global capacity on our doorstep, or on our shorestep, if you will. And that needs to be maximised upon, because when the markets start emerging, as they already are around the world, they will be looking to our expertise to say, you've already started building it, what do you need right now and what can you bring to us?
Just one last comment on that as well. I'm actually much more interested in what goes into a nacelle than the process of assembling it. I think there's a lot more potential for the UK, both in terms of innovative technology and having a broad-based supply chain. Clark, I don't know how many components go into one of your nacelles, but it's quite a lot.
80,000.
Okay, 80,000. So there's 80,000 widgets that we could be working on to get competitive advantage in the UK, and I think that's a very exciting prospect. I can very quickly answer the next one about the public version of the sector deal. Do vote on these, by the way, so that the most interesting questions rise to the top. The reason is that we've agreed with government that it's most helpful if we conduct our detailed conversation, our discussions and negotiations, not in the public arena, which I think is right. So what we've agreed is there's a very detailed version of the prospectus which gets into the detail across all of these areas. But what we've published is I think, a very clear articulation of the vision and what it will take to get there. The details of what we agree around the deal, the negotiated give and take, that's I think quite correctly happening between the sector and government. I'll come back to when the deal will be complete in a minute. Batteries and storage of excess electricity, potentially connected to the sector deal. I guess, Andy, that's very much sitting in the low carbon accelerator.
That's right. I mean, clearly there's a number of us that are already looking at batteries and storage solutions. You know, Ørsted is, we are, Equinor, and others for sure. But the whole kind of concept of our low carbon system accelerator integration work stream is to look much closely at this technology solution, not just storage, but other kind of demand side management products as well, and to develop solutions together, to come closer together. So are we looking at it, and will it be thought about as part of the kind of overcoming the challenges and the enabling of the delivery of this sort of volume of offshore wind? Yeah, and yes it will, and you know, we'll be closely liaising with other stakeholders in that space to make sure we're all joined up in our approach to these things.
Thanks, Andy, and a good conversation for an energy storage conference coming up soon, I'm sure. Whether it's batteries or something else that or batteries and something else, we'll see. Moving on to the next question: how will government judge success? Well, maybe I can briefly talk about the things that I showed those: the exports, the jobs, the impact on communities around the UK. At a high level, that's what defines success for government. What defines success for us, of course, is successfully building out to 30 gigawatts. And I think there's a lot of talk always about UK content in our projects, quite correct, quite understandable. And I think what we should be focusing on is building a strong export-led supply chain that will drive the content of our UK projects up. But much more importantly, it will also mean UK content in the much bigger portfolio of projects internationally. I don't know if any of the four on the panel want to comment in their area about what success, how would government judge success?
I just highlight that we do know from government that one of the issues that we have recognised as the industry that they would be pushing us on if we weren't addressing this is sector diversity, and it's something that many of you will know in your companies you are working on. We at RenewableUK have worked doing our part through this the switch list we published, and how we, for example, have looked at programs and panels in this conference. That's a small part of the wider piece of work, and our initial skills gap analysis shows we've got a lot more to do. So in certain aspects of our industry, we're still very male. In other areas with professional skills, we're doing a lot better, but it's something that we know government is pushing us on, and it's something we're looking at what other sectors are doing to work out what else we can do.
Thanks, Math. Moving on, I know we've got a few more questions and a little bit more time. When can we expect a deal to be complete? I presume that question is really, when can we expect the deal to be struck? I'm hoping the deal will run for several years, if not decades, because it's the start of a journey together with government about a new level of ambition. But in terms of when I'm hoping we can get this deal delivered and agreed and launched, if you like, I'm hoping October. Green Great Britain Week is an activity, I think, to celebrate the first anniversary of the Clean Growth Strategy, and that's a nice hook that we would like to hang the sector deal on. But let's see how the conversations go over the next few weeks with government as we get into the guts of this and agree the details. Civil and military radar issues. I'm going to come back to Andy on that because I think that sits squarely in the low carbon system accelerator.
Yes, I mean those of us with a development background have kind of lost a lot of hair, kind of, you know, dealing with aviation consultees and others, of course, but they're not here to defend themselves. But look, it's a good example of the sort of issue that we want to try and join up a little bit more. And I remarked earlier about one of the sort of sub-work streams of the low carbon system accelerator, which is designed to kind of deal with some of these barriers to or challenges. We should really be looking at them as to deployment. So, you know, I'd hope that we can sort of make some progress on dealing with those sorts of risks as part of this. Yes.
Thanks. We seem to have run out of questions. You're very welcome to use old technology and just ask your question if anyone has one. Patrick. So the question is the supply chain review part of the sector deal? Absolutely. We made a conscious decision to press ahead with this. This isn't a question of waiting until everything's agreed before we start anything. But Victoria, I don't know if you want to explain how it will fit into the broader sector deal work.
So I think the second part of your question was around timescales. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, so our current plan right now is to try and put together a set of clear recommendations by the end of the year, which would then be proposed to OWIC for consultation. By the way, I should mention that we do also have, as a side addition to this, an advisory group being set up with a range of developers and other suppliers so that we can bounce ideas off them over the next few months so we're not working in isolation. So with those recommendations that would go to OWIC, we would see those then being passed on to the Supply Chain Accelerator group around about Q1 next year. But as with anything, we don't want to rush this and not get the right information. We want to have an ambitious timescale so that we can see this work getting started next year. But we are going to take our time and make sure we get the right consultation and the right responses from the supply chain. That's the current plan, yeah.
Any other, before we finish, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I actually asked the question on the 1200 when the judge successful.
Yes.
I was more interested in what the mileposts are.
So what are the milestones on the way to 2030? Yeah, I guess that's all part, at a broad level, that's all part of the negotiation as to what are the interim deliverables that we're going to agree. From our perspective, the thing, of course, that unlocks this is right at the start of this journey, making the pipeline visible and explicit to the supply chain. And also, I didn't mention earlier, but also undertaking a root and branch review of the transmission framework for offshore wind. If we are going to get to 50 gigawatts or beyond, we probably should take a long, hard look at how that works. But I don't know if there are any comments from the panel about those sort of interim milestones, but yeah, what's going to be important, you know, politicians aren't going to wait until 2030 to see if it's a good idea to have agreed this deal. So we will definitely have to put some interim milestones in there, but probably have to wait and see.
I think it's going to come out in the negotiation phase because
Yeah.
we need a proper structured plan to get us to 2030.
Okay, if I don't see, there's nothing else on the screen, no more questions, then just remains for me to thank you all for coming along, thank the panel here for their contributions and answering your questions. If you would like to get hold of a copy of the prospectus, they are available and, as I say, also online. And yeah, I look forward to telling you about the successful sector deal at the next conference. Thank you. Thank you all.